So we've got an article up on sot.net by a guy named Bernardo Kastrup. He's a computer engineering dude from Eindhoven University of Technology. And he's written a book. He's written several books, but he's got a new one that just came out this week. It's called The Idea of the World. I haven't read it yet. I think Corey's been reading it. I'm gonna read it pretty soon. But the article itself is kind of deals with a couple ideas that he will get to in this book. And it is specifically on what is called information realism and why Kastrup says physics is pointing inexorably to mind. So we're just going to take a look at this article and comment on it and just see where the discussion takes us, because there's some really interesting things in here. I don't know if I agree with it 100%, but I like the direction it's going in. So let's get up that article and we're going to read through it. So Kastrup starts out by writing this. In his 2014 book, Our Mathematical Universe, physicist Max Tegmark boldly claims that protons, atoms, molecules, cells, and stars are all redundant baggage. Only the mathematical apparatus used to describe the behavior of matter is supposedly real, not matter itself. For Tegmark, the universe is a set of abstract entities with relations between them, which can be described in a baggage-independent way, that is, without matter. He attributes existence solely to descriptions, while incongruously denying the very thing that is described in the first place. Matter is done away with, and only information itself is taken to be ultimately real. So let's stop there for a second and just talk about that. So what we're talking about here, what Tegmark and Kastrup are talking about is basically, it gets into philosophy. Basically, the question of what is real, what are the units of things, or if not units, what is reality essentially. So there are several, historically and today, there are several options on the market. Of course, you've got. I guess you can break them down into like materialism. So the only things that are real are the things we classify as matter, and within materialism, you've got kind of like old school materialism when matter was seen as kind of this persistent hard stuff, right? These physical solid atoms out of which matter is more large scale things like we experience of matter are made. And then, of course, with the advancements of science in the last 100, 200 years, come to the conclusion that though there is no solid matter, it's actually like energy and fields. And you get to the quantum level and what's going on there. And so I guess you could call that like a modern materialism. Everything is like energy. And then in contrast to the materialisms, you've got the idealism, which is that there is no such thing as matter, and all there is mind. And matter, I guess, is an illusion in one variety of idealism, an illusion like produced by the mind. So all we have are minds perceiving other minds, or mind perceiving itself, and the way in which those minds perceive the matter of mind is as what the thing we call matter, which would go down to what we perceive as and categorize as energy. And then, but there's this other option on the market now because, I guess it's been in the past, like maybe 50, 60 years. I can't remember when this idea first got proposed. The idea that at the basis of things, it's not just like energy, it's actually information, because any kind of specific thing going on in the world, any kind of movement of a particle or interaction between particles can be looked at in terms of information, can be described in terms of information. And kind of one of the simplest ways of describing information in this sense, the way I think about it, comes from Claude Shannon, who developed information theory, but developments after him too. Information as like the reduction of uncertainty. So you've got the way to picture this is like I've done in previous shows, where you have like a set of possibilities, the set of all possibilities, and you can think about this in terms of anything, whether it's the possible words and order of words in order to write a paragraph, whether it's the possible like locations and states of an atom, whether it's the possible movements of your arm. You've got a whole range of possible movements, and then once you collapse those possibilities into a single one, you've made a selection. You've reduced that uncertainty into a relative certainty. And that is one way of describing information, because when you have a word, it is the reduction of an uncertain string of randomness, maybe letters, into something that is certain. So you can kind of make a comparison between the reduction of uncertainty and the reduction of possibilities into actuality. And in that way, we get like specific forms. So like a specific shape is a form of information because it's that one shape as opposed to all other possible shapes. And you see that all the way down into quantum phenomena, where you have a probability function. You have the possible locations of a particle, for instance, and then through measurement that collapses into one position. And but before that, it was a probability. You didn't know exactly where it was. It was a potential, but that potential reduced into an actuality, and so you could describe that as information as well. It's like, okay, these are the precise numbers and measurements that we can use to characterize this like little mini system that we're looking at. And so you can apply that to pretty much anything. It's like, so the movement of that atom, it's moving this direction at this speed, for this amount of time in this across this amount of space. It's doing that, and it's not doing all the other possibilities. So it's a very specific thing. And then you have things interacting with each other, and they interact in specific ways. So just to go back to like a topic that we've talked about, DNA and evolution. Mm-hmm. When you look at information in that sense, it's like you've got all this DNA, which is information. It's a code, and it's information because it's specified. It's saying it's like this specific sequence as opposed to all other possible sequence. There's the reduction of uncertainty from a field of possible sequences to a specific sequence that is functional. So an information realist is basically, according to Kastrup, like Tegmark, like this guy, who's saying that, well, the only real thing is the information. It's the mathematics and like the measurements and the things behind the appearance of the things that we measure and look at. Only that is real. That the actual things in themselves that are, I guess you could say, maybe, well, he wouldn't say this, but embodying that information, embodying those principles and those formula and those features, like I guess you could call them like charge and spin and whatever physical features there are at that level, that it's the information itself that is the only real thing. And this is kind of a more radical or extreme version of some of the ideas I've read in the past, where basically they're arguing that, well, information may not be the only thing, but it's actually fundamental. So you couldn't have like atoms with properties and subatomic particles with properties and specific features without an underlying information. Basically, that the it, which is the particle or the atom, comes from the bit, the information. The information describes the system, and the system conforms to that information, conforms to those possibilities. So Tegmark is saying, no, all you need is the mathematical description. And so in Saw, we've got this comment on there with a quote from Robin Collingwood's book Specula Mentis, which we've described on the show before, on this kind of fallacy of abstraction. And so Collingwood wrote, for it must be borne in mind that the abstract concept is nothing but the abstract structure of the sensible world. And therefore, if the concept alone is real, the world whose structure it is will be mere appearance and not reality. And therefore, the world will be a class whose members are not real. Mathematics is nothing but the assertion of the abstract concept, and it can give us no account of the presuppositions of this assertion. Mathematical logic is only the shadow of science itself. It is the truth, but the truth about nothing. It is the description of the structure of a null class. Hence, though the hypotheses of empirical science must have some kind of categorical basis, they cannot find this in mathematics, which is the very distilled essence of hypothesis itself. The abstract cannot rest upon the more abstract, but only upon the concrete. So this is the direction that Kastrup seems to be going in this article, because he continues. This abstract notion, called information realism, is philosophical in character, but it has been associated with physics from its very inception. Most famously, information realism is a popular philosophical underpinning for digital physics. The motivation for this association is not hard to fathom. Indeed, according to the Greek atomists, if we kept on dividing things into ever smaller bits, at the end there would remain solid, indivisible particles called atoms, imagined to be so concrete as to have even particular shapes. Yet, as our understanding of physics progressed, we've realized that atoms themselves can be further subdivided or further divided into smaller bits, and those into yet smaller ones, and so on, until what is left lacks shape and solidity altogether. So this is what I said at the beginning. At the bottom of the chain of physical reduction, there are only elusive, phantasmal entities we label as energy and fields, abstract conceptual tools for describing nature, which themselves seem to lack any real concrete essence. So we've talked about this in previous shows. I think it was only a couple weeks ago where we talked about this, like the fallacy of abstraction and the pitfalls that come about from believing in your own abstractions, believing that your abstractions describe reality. And this is what Whitehead called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And Collingwood said the same thing in Speculamentus when he's describing the pitfalls of abstraction. Because what you're basically doing, you're coming up with a general description of a concrete fact, and then taking that general abstract description and saying that that is the actual fact. So that the fact that you were studying in the first place, from which you derived this abstraction, doesn't really exist. The only thing that exists is your abstraction of it. And then you can use your definition of that abstraction and the features that you kind of impart into that abstraction to then provide a complete description of reality. And Collingwood and Whitehead both were like, well, no, it doesn't work that way. You can't do that. And that's what matter is. So Whitehead and Kastrup would agree here that matter is an abstraction, because we have we abstract from the particulars of our experience, the shared features of all the things we consider material, and we come up with this abstraction that we call matter, which lacks any interior. Like if I were to just study, the people and the objects in this room, I could classify them all as matter, but that wouldn't capture the whole of reality, because there are actual beings in this room, including humans and several ladybugs. And to reduce them to just the properties of matter, which is basically just like atoms in motion and interaction with each other, it's something that is missing in that analysis. So it should just be common sense that you can't take your abstractions to describe reality. That reality is something that your abstractions can kind of grasp a bit of, can account for a bit of it, but it can't account for the whole of it. And so, well, I'd say even with energy and fields, when we're looking and describing, measuring, and when we're measuring energy and fields, and we're looking at the properties that of the things that we call energy and fields, even that is an abstraction. So let's say we're taking a measurement, and then describing the things we call energy and fields in terms of those measurements, in terms of those things that are observable. That doesn't mean that we've plumbed the depths of energy and fields. There's potentially and probably more to those phenomena than can be captured in those abstract descriptions, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, in his book, the idea of the world, Kastrup really gets into how this misplaced concreteness has gaslighted or gaslit the Western mind, for centuries. Because as he points out, one of the problems is that we've been told, or we all believe, that mind and matter are a dichotomy, And in a dichotomy, when you understand one half of the equation, then that tells you what the other half is doing. So if you have the dichotomy of hot and cold, if you measure something and you know it's hot, then you know it's not cold. Or life and death, if you are talking to someone and you're having a good time, then you know that they're not dead. But with the problem is that mind and matter aren't that, they don't have that same relationship. So you can't use matter to explain the mind and vice versa, because as you said, matter is just an abstraction that comes from the mind. So that is the crux of the entire hard problem of consciousness. That's why philosophers have been wrestling for it for so long, is trying to explain what created the abstraction through the abstraction. But as he points out, it's actually the concrete reality that we are observing, which led to the need to create this hypothesis about what the world is. And so we needed to understand why we all share the same world, why we have these correlations with our internal experience and the physical world. And I can't remember the third one, but let's just say those two are pretty big things that are explained by the matter hypothesis. However, they aren't that physicality is still just a hypothesis. It's an abstract way of comprehending the world and why it acts the way it does outside of our internal mind. Oh, the third one was, why we can't just interfere in the processes of nature with our own volition, with just the mind. So it remains a hypothesis to explain those three basic facts of human existence in this world that we live in. And it's done remarkably well to explain it for a long time. However, as we've pointed out in last week's show, and we continue to point out, it can't be used to explain the nature of the mind, because the mind is what created it. The mind needed it to explain something, and if it worked for a certain number of problems, that doesn't mean that it's going to work for every problem. It doesn't mean that it's true. It means that it's useful. And one of the problems, I think, like you said, Harrison, was that that people become they fall in love with this abstraction. It's like they fall in love with the sense of power, kind of the sense of completion that it provides, that exactly what is out there, and
comfort.
that they have the comfort and the fact that you can manipulate it. I can say with absolute certainty what the universe is. But as he points out in his book, this is misplaced certainty. It's narcissism. When you worship, it's kind of like worshiping at a false idol. You forget what you deny the divinity of humanity, and you worship at the feet of this false idol that is materialism. And as you pointed out, it's fundamentally based on a bad way of seeing the world. That mind and matter aren't a dichotomy. They're not like hot and cold, or life and death, or thick and thin. You can't measure one and know what the other one is. It's a completely different relationship. There are dichotomies within mind, there are dichotomies within this physical world, and there's dichotomies within the properties of the physical world. But you can't use the mind, or to explain, or you can't use matter to explain the mind.
Well, I'd just like us to kind of get back to the very beginning of the essay, because to underscore what it is that's being said here. So his criticism, it would seem to be, in looking at Max Tegmark's book, Our Mathematical Universe, he's basically saying, as far as I understand, that Tegmark is using mathematics as his way of coming at this this whole dichotomy, and mistaking whatever comprehension he has, whatever understanding there is of the universe and forms and things that exist through mathematics, as a kind of whole enchilada.
Yeah.
So that's his point of departure here, and it's really kind of a fine point, because we're not used to thinking of the way in which information is being used to describe reality versus matter, and he's coming at this in a way that I think, makes distinctions that we're not even used to making and thinking about.
Yeah, because because Tegmark does have a point, and I'd even agree with him over the people that deny mathematics. We discussed this last year sometime when we were talking about mathematical realism, how there are people who, like philosophers and even mathematicians themselves, who deny like the reality of numbers, for instance, and mathematics in general. But that doesn't seem to work. It seems to be that mathematics are a real thing. But they're this non-physical, like abstract thing. Mm-hmm. And the world does seem to be intimately tied to mathematics. Like things seem to behave in mathematical ways, so that you can get you can describe reality in terms of mathematics, and reality behaves according to the not necessarily the laws, but the dynamics or the principles, or just the equations of mathematics. There seems to be this like intimate marriage between the two. So when you actually realize that, then for sure you like the first thing to say is, yes, mathematics is real. But Tegmark, according to Kastrup, goes a bit too far by saying that mathematics is the only real thing, as opposed to just saying that somehow it is tied with this thing that we experience as the physical world, as the world in which we find ourselves. So yeah, there's the fine distinction. Like on the one hand, he's right. Like mathematics and information are real and are important, but you then have to ask and answer the question of, well, how are they real in relation to what are they real? Like, are they the ultimate bits of reality? Or are they themselves part of a more fundamental something that makes up reality? So this is the direction that Kastrup is going to go into. He's going to be arguing that the most ultimate thing the most ultimate and the most fundamental thing is mind itself. So mind itself can't be reduced to either matter or mathematics. But maybe mathematics and information can be understood in terms of the mind. At least that's where I think he's going. We'll find out. So continuing on, so he just gave this description of like materialism and the labels of energy and fields that we give to these phantasmal entities. So then he writes, to some physicists, this indicates that what we call matter with its solidity and concreteness is an illusion, that only the mathematical apparatus they devise in their theories is truly real, not the perceived world the apparatus was created to describe in the first place. From their point of view, such a counterintuitive conclusion is an implication of theory, not a conspicuously narcissistic and self-defeating proposition. So what he's basically saying there is that what these people are saying is that, oh, we've got a theory, and this is just the counterintuitive conclusion that comes from our theory. And because we believe our theory is true, this must be true. Like the world must be an illusion because of the theory. And it's not just a self-defeating proposition because we've got this theory that accounts for everything, and because theory seems to be correct. But that's kind of ridiculous. And Kastrup might be framing it in a way in which to make his point here. But he does have a point, because it doesn't matter where it comes from, if it's your theory or not. If your position is self-defeating, then if it's self-contradictory, then it's not worth having. Like that means there's something wrong with your theory. It means there's something wrong with the way you're thinking about it. You're missing something. So if you're coming to a conclusion that denies this very basic common sense, then your theory needs revising and maybe being thrown out. This is for the same reason that postmodernism, in its truth-denying varieties, should be abandoned, because you can't argue for the truth of a theory that denies truth, because you're implicitly presupposing the existence of a truth and that your own theory is true. It doesn't make any sense. So the theory itself should just be thrown out. It means there's something going wrong in your theory at some point, either in the course of like the argumentation, or in your very basic like axioms or principles or presuppositions. Something's wrong. Like one of the premises in your argument is just wrong because it's leading you to an absurdity. So he goes on. Indeed, according to information realists, matter arises from information processing, not the other way around. Even mind, psyche, soul, is supposedly a derivative phenomenon of purely abstract information manipulation. But in such a case, what exactly is meant by the word information, since there is no physical or mental substrate to ground it? So this is an interesting point. He doesn't really expand on this, but it's, I think he probably does in his book, I'm guessing. Because, so if we're calling something information, first of all, what do we mean by that? He'll get to that in a little bit. But then he has this interesting statement: since there is no physical or mental substrate to ground it, everything that we think of as information has a substrate. When you think about it, books have like the ink and paper on which they're printed. Radio waves carrying information from like a radio source that has been encoded has like those waves are encoding that information. And DNA has the actual the double helix where the information is coded in a physical way. But then when like the other types of information that we generally think about, because when we are putting information into a physical substrate, what we're doing is we're basically transferring it from our mind, from our imagination into the physical world in some way. We do this through speech. That's the most basic way, one of the most basic ways. But we have all of these kind of external ways to also do that. So instead of speaking, we can write it down, and we can transmit it through a physical, through another physical means. We can do it physically through our vocal cords and the sounds that we make, or we can put it into a book and it'll last for a lot longer than our speech. Or we can record our speech, and that will then live on for longer than the speech itself has lasted. Because you think about, like, before there were any kind of recording devices, before there was even the written language, all we had were speaking to each other. And the only way to record that would be through memory. And so, there are some historical hints that people, at least some cultures, had very advanced like memory techniques. So of course, they could remember something like something as long as the Iliad, or potentially more. Just through memorization we could transmit this. But now that we have multiple terabyte hard drives, we can store vastly more amount of information more easily, and we produce way more information. But the main point is just that that there seems to have to be some kind of substrate in which information in which information exists. And the other one he gives, so he says there's no physical or mental substrate, because the ultimate substrate for information is a mind. Is that so when you are thinking of what to say, when you're having an internal dialogue, when you're looking at internal visual imagery, mental imagery, when you're composing a song in your head, when you're hearing music in your head, that is all information. It's all meaningful, but it arguably isn't in a physical substrate. Now you could argue that because you are using your brain, that information is somehow in your brain. Well, that may be the case in some sense if there is a one-to-one correlation between every thought you have and every brain state. But I think not Tegmark, but Kastrup and several of his colleagues and several of the people we talk about will argue that no, the mind does not need a brain in order to process information or to think. That the mind is a more fundamental part of that equation, where basically the mind thinks, the mind has information in it, and then that information may then get encoded in a pattern of brain activity. Or the body, all the various aspects of your body, your organs, all your nerves, and all the different kind of chemical pathways for transferring information for communication within your body, all of that presents information to the brain. So there we've got another physically instantiated, method of or physically instantiated information within the body that presents itself to the brain. The brain does stuff with it. That then gets presented to the mind, to your consciousness, to your perception in some way. A lot of it doesn't, but some of it does, like pain, very easily. We all understand pain. We all understand the meaning of pain, and that is a transfer of meaningful information from the source of the pain to your own consciousness. So you have the experience of pain. So if you're going to argue that information is the only thing that exists, well, you kind of have to answer the question, well, where is that information? Like, how do we think about information? Like, is information within itself, or like the only thing that intuitively makes sense, based on our experience, unless we're just going to speculate about things that we have no experience of, in which case we can come up with anything, then we need to basically look at the examples of our experience, at what it means, because experience basically provides us with the only things that we can work with. We can't know anything that is outside of our experience, just by definition. So where do we find information? We find it in physical and mental substrates. So do you want me to go on, or do you guys have anything to say about that?
Well, no, I just wanted to add that, and the only way that information becomes information is when with the mind.
Right.
Without that, then you don't have the observer. You don't have any real, like that wave collapsing event that they talk about in quantum theory, which creates that information, I guess, gateway, pathway, or whatever, that collapses the system so that you get an observation, you get a measurement. And I think Kastrup writes in the book about one of the driving forces behind this attempt to find a third way of explaining matter and the mind, and it goes back to that prejudice against the mind, and that hard problem, that impossibility of finding a way of explaining, the impossible task of explaining the mind through the abstraction, just one abstraction that it came up with. And so if you're trying to find the ultimate source of reality, and you've done away with mind and matter because you can't explain the two in our current way of thinking, and then you find information, it's attractive and it's alluring, and it also, in many ways, is, like you said, it's a fundamental part of the universe, and it's a huge breakthrough to understand the nature of information. But you can't understand it without the mind, and as we said, it would make more sense to put the mind first, that the mind or the experience of the information is the ultimate, is the ultimate. And that's what Kastrup argues, is that if you're trying to find this ultimate artifact, this ultimate primitive, as I think that's called in physics, that you're best using the mind, because that's all that we have. That's how we experience. That's all we know for sure. That's everything else out there is a hypothesis, is a theory, but we know, I hope that we know that we have a mind, and that we are experiencing. When I feel pain, I know I feel pain. Nobody has to prove it to me. If I feel, sweetness, or if I taste sweet or sour, any kind of experience that I have, that is the core, that he argues that is the ultimate in the universe.
Mm-hmm. Well, just to go off on that a bit, I think there's a truth in there, but even that can be taken a bit too far, and that's what Whitehead called, I believe, the subjectionist, or the subjectivist principle, I believe is what he called it, when he was analyzing Descartes and Locke and Hume. That all we know is that we have a mind and that we have experiences. But Whitehead would argue that that's not all we know. It is the fundamental thing that we know, but intimately tied with that knowledge is the knowledge that there are other things that we know. So when we have an experience of something, it isn't just a sensory experience that is totally divorced from some other thing, and we can't tell if we're in an illusion and dreaming it, or if there's some other thing. Whitehead would argue that on a very basic level, we have a direct knowledge, a direct experience of that other thing, and that's why we have the experience of it. So we can only know something through our own subjectivity, through our own experience, but embedded within that that experience and that knowledge of the self is this implicit knowledge of the other, of the other things around us that we are experiencing. So those two are tied together. The question then is, what are the natures of those things? What is the nature of like myself as an experiencing subject, and of the things that I experience as objects that present themselves to my experience? So that's a question that Kastrup deals with too. Not so much in this article, but again, I'm guessing more so in his book, which we'll get to. So he goes on. The last point we just made is that so the whole idea of what is this information if there's no physical or mental substrate, and really, what is this information if information itself is, as far as we know, derivative of minds, right? Information is an expression of intelligence. Intelligences, or like organisms, are what create meaning. They have meaning in themselves, and they create the meaning in the information in their behaviors and in like a higher form of life, like in humanity, through their thoughts. So Kastrup goes on writing, "You see, it is one thing to state in language that information is primary and can therefore exist independently of mind and matter. But it is another thing entirely to explicitly and coherently conceive of what, if anything, this may mean. By way of analogy, it is possible to write, as Lewis Carroll did, that the Cheshire Cat's grin remains after the cat disappears. But it is another thing entirely to conceive explicitly and coherently of what this means. Our intuitive understanding of this concept of information, as cogently captured by Claude Shannon in 1948, is that it is merely a measure of the number of possible states of an independently existing system. As such, information is a property of an underlying substrate associated with the substrate's possible configurations, not an entity unto itself." So I mentioned Claude Shannon earlier, maybe to just give a little background on what he's talking about here. So for Claude Shannon, information wasn't the meaning of anything. It was simply like the information-bearing capacity of your substrate. So if you had, like in binary, if you had, I hope I'm going to get this right. So you have zeros and ones in binary. You have two options, right? So if you have 5 characters, that's 5 bits, right? 5 zeros or ones. I'm guessing there because I'm really not an information technologist. So you've got possible states there. You've got 2 possible states in the first position, 2 in the second, etc. So you've got a total number of possibilities. So the information carrying capacity of that string of numbers is going to be a certain number, and like the longer the string is and the more possibilities, the more information carrying capacity it's going to have. So you could say that like in this string of whatever the substrate is, you can have there's a million possibilities or something. So the chances of having like this one sequence is 1 in a million. And like you can describe that capacity in terms of bits, but it doesn't say anything about what the actual information is. So you could describe DNA in terms of like information carrying capacity, but it doesn't describe at all what the DNA actually does or what it actually is. It's just like the possible states of this sequence of DNA. And when you get to actual meaningful information, like a code, and this might be like a cipher, a password or something, that password then becomes meaningful because it has a function, it has a meaning to it, and it is a very it is an improbable sequence of. It's one possible sequence out of this vast number of possible sequences. That's why you want to pick good passwords, because you don't want them to be able to be guessed. You have like the longer the better, and the more like random seeming numbers you have, because the harder it is to guess, because you're collapsing collapsing the uncertainty. Like if there were a password, like imagine a password setup where every character, it's like every character could be any other character. So no matter what you type, all the passwords work, right? That would not be a good password, because you would just type in any sequence of those letters and you would get into the system. What you need is the they're really like the reduction of that of those possibilities into one specific sequence, and that's what a password is. So Cloud Shannon basically he himself had an abstraction of information as this a measure of the number of possible states. So and that's pretty much it. He didn't get into the meaning. So that's why Kastrup goes on to say that information exists in and of itself is akin to speaking of spin without the top, of ripples without water, of a dance without the dancer, or of the Cheshire Cat's grin without the cat. It is a grammatically valid statement devoid of sense, a word game less meaningful than fantasy, for internally consistent fantasy can at least be explicitly and coherently conceived as such. One assumes that serious proponents of information realism are well aware of this line of criticism. How do they reconcile their position with it? A passage by Luciano Floridi may provide a clue. In a section titled The Nature of Information, he states, "Information is notoriously a polymorphic phenomenon and a polysemantic concept, so, as an explicandum, it can be associated with several explanations, depending on the level of abstraction adopted, and the cluster of requirements and desiderata orienting a theory. Information remains an elusive concept." So it's basically a long and wordy way of saying that last bit. Information remains an elusive concept. Kastrup writes, "Such obscure ambiguity lends information realism a conceptual fluidity that makes it unfalsifiable. After all, if the choice of primitive is given, is that right? If the choice of primitive is given by an elusive concept, how can one definitely establish that it is wrong? In admitting the possibility that information may be a network of logically interdependent but mutually irreducible concepts, Floridi seems to suggest even that such elusiveness is inherent and unresolvable. Whereas vagueness may be defensible in regard to natural entities conceivably beyond the human ability to apprehend, it is difficult to justify when it comes to a human concept, such as information. We invented the concept, so we either specify clearly what we mean by it, or our conceptualization remains too vague to be meaningful. In the latter case, there is literally no sense in attributing primary existence to information. The untenability of information realism, however, does not erase the problem that motivated it to begin with. The information that, at bottom, what we call matter becomes pure abstraction, a phantasm. How can the felt concreteness and solidity of the perceived world evaporate out of existence when we look closely at matter? To make sense of this conundrum, we don't need word games of information realism. Instead, we must stick to what is most immediately present to us. Solidity and concreteness are qualities of our experience. The world measured, modeled, and ultimately predicted by physics is the world of perceptions, a category of mentation. The phantasms and abstractions reside merely in our descriptions of the behavior of that world, not in the world itself. Anyone want to comment on that bit?
Well, like you said, Harrison, I mean, you can go a little bit too far and say that everything is subjective, but I think that that he's really onto something, and that he's really trying to kick the status quo in the behind, and he's trying to advance a way of viewing the world that puts everything back into perspective, so that you have that theories don't become the gods and the idols that everyone worships, that rather that theories are seen as what they are, as theories, and yet we still retain an open mind to mind itself, and that we put things back to where they belong, like we're saying that the driving force behind all of these attempts to come up with ways of structuring the universe. That's the big thing, is trying to structure the universe. What is at the foundation? What is the universe really? Is it just matter, or is it just information? Is it this panpsychism? Does everything experience? All these are very big questions. How can you understand where the mind came from? And if it just came out of nothing, if it came out of nowhere, when there was the first living being that was capable of some form of consciousness that we have, it just came out of nowhere? I mean, the serious questions that people would say that they belong in like a philosophy 101 class. I think that's what the logical positivists and the more analytical branch of philosophy would say. However, the human machine, our machine isn't wired to see reality in just that manner. We do have, as Jordan Peterson would say, we're structured. We have a left hemisphere that will view things the way we know them, a right hemisphere that is more towards the unknown, and that we do have a capacity to be both analytical and to still embrace a more broad and fluid, more being-centered way of viewing the world, of seeing it in a phenomenological way, like Collingwood would say, being able to get inside the events. And so we have the capacity to do that, and it's important, I think, to utilize both of those capabilities, both of those ways of viewing the world, because otherwise we have a one-sided development. We end up like just automated automatons that we worship. And I think that's what he's really trying to do. I haven't read his other books, but in The Idea of the World, he says that he tackles this problem with that more analytic way of seeing things. The logical, logic is just the handmaiden of science. It's not. There's no such thing as. There's no meaning to the question, what is the meaning of life? There's no meaning to questions like where did consciousness come from or what is a mind. He tried to write that book, and he wrote this article in that vein where you're very much focused on the nuts and bolts and the logical arguments and getting to the depth of it. But he's also written other works where he says he's more of a continental type philosopher, more like the Kant or the Heidegger and the people who are, just really, the kind of romantic and experientialist types of philosophers. And he's written books like that too. So he has utilized both approaches to try and hammer home, I think, the point that there's a lot more to what's going on than just this theoretical, bleached way of viewing the world. And it's almost impossible, I think, to live our lives denying that. By wholeheartedly denying that, we create a contradiction within ourselves where we deny our own experience. Mm-hmm. And we look, I imagine from like a cosmic mind perspective, you look down, you'd be like, what are they trying to do there? They don't exist. What are they wishing for non-existence? Or, what I think it's definitely a big conversation, and he handles it extremely well. He has the arguments. He really tries to bolster them with scientific evidence in his book. He does draw on scientific evidence to show that physicalism, materialism can't be right. That it's scientifically testable that it is false. It's not how the universe works.
Well, this whole discussion reminds me greatly of the arguments that are being put to Michael Behe's discussion of intelligent design and evolution, where the scientists who are, and these are heavy hitters, who are most vocal in their criticism of Behe's discoveries, what they seem to do is come up with their own theories as to how things have evolved in their minds, but that have absolutely little to no kind of provable demonstrations. It's all something that they've just sort of imagined to be real, and then they proceed from those imaginary developments and ideas of evolution to use those to assume that they are absolutely true, and to use as a point of departure from which to try and knock down Behe's assertions, which aren't even assertions. They're just observations that are based on his experience of observable data and objective fact, and are completely well reasoned out. So it seems to me that these scientists who are most vocal in criticizing Behe are kind of the living examples right now of this false dichotomy, who are embodying the materialist way of thinking, even as they try and explain the most cogent, coherent, fact-based arguments for intelligent design. It just seems it just screams for knocking down, and that's exactly what we've been reading in articles on SOT. We've been seeing Behe knock down these arguments one after the next after the next. So that seems to be one of the most egregious or at least obvious examples to me of how many scientists take their own abstractions and imaginings for truth, and are unwilling to experience, for lack of a better word, the facts and the discoveries and the kind of coherent reasoning and logic behind intelligent design that we've been looking at in these past many shows and discussions.
Well, we're getting to the end of the show today, so let's just, I'm going to read and finish this article. It's just a few paragraphs more, and then we'll give our final thoughts on it. So Kastrup goes on. Where we get lost and confused is in imagining that what we are describing is a non-mental reality underlying our perceptions, as opposed to the perceptions themselves. We then try to find the solidity and concreteness of the perceived world in that postulated underlying reality. However, a non-mental world is inevitably abstract. And since solidity and concreteness are felt qualities of experience, what else? We cannot find them there. The problem we face is thus merely an artifact of thought, something we conjure up out of thin air because of our theoretical habits and prejudices. Tegmark is correct in considering matter, defined as something outside and independent of mind, to be unnecessary baggage. But the implication of this fine and indeed brave conclusion is that the universe is a mental construct displayed on the screen of perception. Tegmark's mathematical universe is inherently a mental one, for where does mathematics, numbers, sets, equations, exist, if not in mentation? As I elaborate extensively in my new book, The Idea of the World, none of this implies solipsism. The mental universe exists in mind, but not in your personal mind alone. Instead, it is a transpersonal field of mentation that presents itself to us as physicality, with its concreteness, solidity, and definiteness, once our personal mental processes interact with it through observation. This mental universe is what physics is leading us to, not the hand-waving word games of information realism. So he ends it there. And so he is basically coming out as an idealist in the end, saying that everything is mind. And I've had my problems with pure idealism in the past, but I think it may be the case that when you take any of these positions like to their extremes, they kind of end up meeting again at the extremes, like in a circle. They end up meeting. And the reason I say that is because, like, if you take physicalism, like materialism, and you do argue that matter is everything, then if you come to the conclusion that matter is everything, but that matter is conscious, then you end up with a position that argues that consciousness is somehow fundamental to reality too. And if you argue that mentality is everything, but that the way in which mind experiences itself is as what we perceive as like physical, then you still have something that we call matter, that we call physicality, but that ultimately comes from mind. It's like it's hard to see where the distinctions are to be made, and where one kind of goes to the other. I think this is why I prefer Whitehead so far, in that he basically argues that like the fundamental bits of the universe aren't physical, but they're not just mental either. They are what he calls like actual occasions. There are things that are experienced as actual, as like whatever we experience as physical, but also what we experience as mental. So every part of the universe, from the smallest like subatomic particle and wave and field to the most complex, is both a subject and an object. It is a subject that experiences itself and other beings, other organisms as objects, but it is also a subject, just like all the other like organisms or beings in the universe which with it interacts. It's kind of like it's two sides of a coin almost, where you look at it from one perspective and it's physical, and you look at it from another perspective and it's mental. So maybe they're essentially saying the same thing with different emphases, because at least that's the way that it appears to me, just based on this short article. But I guess we'll find out. Do you know the answers, Corey? Do you know all the answers?
I know all of them. I'm not going to share them, though. It'd blow your mind.
You're going to keep them to yourself?
No, I was thinking that that there has to be some sort of it seems like they're like, when these kinds of debates occur, they do tend to happen on the same level, on this kind of theoretical level. But with all of that, we've discussed intelligent design, and Ilan has brought it up. Those scientific discoveries kind of beg the question. They kind of call out for a philosophy that could account for the kinds of intelligence.
Yeah.
And Kastrup doesn't really go into that in his book, the World of or the Idea of the World. He basically just sets out kind of a theoretical framework for how there could be other consciousness in the universe, how the entire universe could be conscious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And but to come up to come face to face with the kinds of intelligence that science shows us, I think that it sends a lot of people packing. I think it's just so intense to see the kinds, it's threatening too, because it's like, if somebody's watching you, it's your, driving down the street, or walking down the street, you feel like somebody's eyes on your back, and you don't know but you just feel like someone's watching you. It's something similar to that. It's just something that, I think that intelligent design, I think it'll probably just be a natural outcome that if that, continues to gain momentum, that there will be philosophers that will answer the call of what kinds of intelligence there is in the universe. And I think you're gonna need a theory like this to explain how there could be intelligence like this, and not in just a bunch of aliens. The Alex Jones theory that the aliens came and they just threw threw some magic dust or whatever, some space dust down, and then it turned into microbes. I think that you're going to want to have some kind of a theory that explains that, and it's not going to just be the typical kind of panpsych, everything is conscious versus everything is matter type debate. But that it's nice. It'll be good to restore balance to that debate, to put a little bit more weight on the consciousness side, to get more people thinking and probing the idea of what kind of intelligence is out there. If everything is information, are there multiple levels of intelligence? When you look at the fine tuning of the universe, that is so that it can support life. Whereas, as physicists say that, I think it was in the book The Rare Earth, they argue that it's the universe is fine tuned, the planet was fine tuned, everything, so that you could have life. Is there an intelligence that is at that level? And then there's nested hierarchies of intelligence all the way down to us, and down and down and down. Until you get to the bacteria. And we talked in the consciousness anatomy of the soul about how there seems to be these big jumps on Earth every 200 million years. how high does it go?
Yeah, I think that's one of the gaps that I see in the kind of current debate, where for the people for the pro intelligent design people who seem to be the only people kind of considering this in relation to science, or there are others, but they're the most vocal, I think. How they will recognize, along with all kinds of other philosophers and people not even related to ID, that there is a range of intelligences from humans and below, or from like bacteria to humans. And then you'll get like panpsychists, pan-experientialists, and like the variety of people like that, like Whitehead and David Ray Griffin, who will argue that that consciousness goes down to subatomic particles to some degree, that there is some like iota of experience in even the most simplest thing in the universe. But then where all of them seem to stop is that they've got, okay, so from atoms and stuff up to humans, and then God. So there's a super intelligence, a vast intelligence, like that is the most like unfathomably intelligent and whatever else we can ascribe to it. And then there's humans and everything below. Well, could there be like intelligences like between like humans and that ultimate level? I mean, it at least seems plausible if there are all these other intelligences, if there's so many vast degrees of intelligence from protons up to humans, you'd think that maybe it would at least be possible that there might be like individualized intelligences like between the level of us and the ultimate. And so what might the role be of like intelligence of that sort? Like that would be a question, to ask and to hopefully answer or speculate about, but no one's really doing that, at least to my knowledge. The only place you've had that is in like the religious traditions of theology and speculation and mystical experience of higher intelligence, like angels, or demons or whatever like that. So
and framed in the way you did, Harrison, it's completely reasonable to think that as above, so below, that there is some omnipotent, if there is some kind of higher level being, such as a god or a cosmic mind or something, that there would be these different levels of intelligence between human beings and that higher being and intelligence, whatever it is. But I think it comes down very much to human arrogance and the idea that because science hasn't yet theorized or come up with ideas that are satisfying enough to a lot of the neo-Darwinists, that it therefore can't be so.
Mm-hmm. I don't think it's. I think there's some arrogance, but I don't think it's entirely like unjustified, because like we can see bacteria like now in our everyday experience. We don't have the obvious experience of like super intelligences that we have of like stink bugs and ladybugs and microbes and all these other like intelligences that are within our everyday experience. And that's why a lot of people even reject the idea of God or a cosmic mind, because they can't see how that applies to their everyday life. Some get there philosophically, say, oh, there must be this overarching like intelligence that could exist, even though I have no direct experience of it to my knowledge. But on the one hand, I think that it is at least justified in that it's hard to believe in things that you don't see. But that's a topic for another show. We're gonna end it there for today. So we'll be coming back and talking about this more in the coming weeks. So thanks for tuning in. See you guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.